$40,000. That's the exact number separating the audacity of a young heir from the arrogance of an old master. There was no contract signed by corporate lawyers, no league executives monitoring the financial transactions, and no high-definition television camera managed to capture the exact moment the deal was sealed between the two players. All that existed there was the hot breath of two relentless competitors in the middle of a hardwood court, sweat dripping steadily onto the polished floor, and a verbal promise that carried the weight of an entire professional basketball career. The premise was deceptively simple, but the execution would prove tragic for one of them. To understand how the story unfolded with such precision, we need to place the two main characters at center stage in the very first minute of this account. On one side, wearing the blue and yellow number 31 jersey of the Indiana Pacers, stood Reggie Miller. He was thin, wiry, with long angular bones that seemed to jut out from smooth skin, and a mouth that moved at a far faster pace than his own legs could run. On the other side, in the classic green and white number 33 uniform of the Boston Celtics, stood Larry Bird. His back was already completely locked up by chronic pain that forced him to lie on the bench floor on a towel just to keep his muscles from seizing. His knees no longer had the protective cartilage of 10 years before, but his eyes could still register the rotation rate of a ball before it even left an opponent's shooting hand. Reggie Miller believed he had finally cracked the veteran's secret code. He genuinely believed that time had taken its physical toll on Larry Bird, the man known worldwide as Larry Legend. Miller was playing in his own house at the mystical Market Square Arena, in front of a raucous crowd that breathed Midwestern American basketball with an intensity bordering on religion, made of silences and perfect free throws. For the young guard straight out of the sun-drenched, noisy playgrounds of Southern California, challenging the greatest icon in the history of the state of Indiana on his own turf was the definitive move to inherit the crown of the Eastern Conference. But Reggie's boundless ambition crashed against an invisible wall of absolute certainty. The $40,000 bet wasn't just about who would make the next basket of the game, but about one man's supernatural ability to predict the fate of a leather ball through 25 feet of cold air-conditioned air before even releasing it. To grasp the magnitude of the strategic mistake Reggie Miller was making that night, we need to unpack the psychological and biographical foundation of these two men. Reggie wasn't an ordinary competitor shaped by traditional coaches. He had grown up under the massive physical and technical shadow of his older sister Cheryl Miller, whom many analysts considered the most talented, dominant, and terrifying athlete women's basketball had ever produced in its entire history. When Reggie was just a skinny, awkward kid trying to find his own space on the rough concrete courts of his family's backyard, Cheryl destroyed him physically without any mercy. She blocked him in the air, shoved him into the galvanized wire fence, scored on him repeatedly in his face, and used raw, humiliating words to test the limits of his mental and emotional endurance. It was exactly in this environment of family competitive oppression that Reggie developed his ultimate survival mechanism, a sharp, fast, relentless tongue that worked as a weapon of mass distraction. He learned that if you can't dominate an opponent through size or muscle, you have to infiltrate their mind, tear down their self-confidence from the inside out, and make them fail through pure psychological frustration. When Miller entered the National Basketball Association after being drafted in the first round in 1987, the Indiana Pacers' own local fan base rejected him fiercely. On draft day, the fans packing the auditorium booed the front office's pick because they desperately wanted Steve Alford, a local hero who had led Indiana University to the NCAA national title under the rigid, temperamental command of the legendary coach Bob Knight. Reggie took that deafening sound of disapproval from thousands of people from his own city, stored it in the deepest core of his chest, and turned it into pure rocket fuel, into directed competitive hatred. He didn't respect the league's established veterans, didn't ask anyone's permission to occupy space on the court, and feared no historic name printed on the back of a jersey. He had already traded heavy insults with Michael Jordan in Chicago, had challenged the entire New York Knicks crowd and filmmaker Spike Lee courtside at Madison Square Garden, and genuinely felt that no human being on the planet was immune to his signature verbal venom. To him, Larry Bird was just the next slow dinosaur in line for biological extinction. Reggie Miller's fatal error was trying to use verbal venom against the man who had been born and raised in the very isolated laboratory where that venom was first synthesized. Larry Bird wasn't just an elite basketball player with 3 championship rings on his finger. He was a cold psychological predator disguised as a rural Midwestern laborer. Born in French Lick, a small, forgotten rural community of hot springs and dirt sidewalks in the Indiana backcountry, Bird learned to read the world around him through absolute silence, mechanical repetition, and meticulous observation. His father, a war veteran of few words and tragic fate, left him the practical legacy that a man's true worth is only tested and validated when external pressure reaches a level that would be considered intolerable and crushing for ordinary people. Mechanically speaking, Bird was a complete anomaly in a league governed by supremely gifted athletes and sprinters in the 80s. He couldn't outrun opposing guards, and his vertical leap rarely cleared a scant few inches off the hardwood floor. If he put a sheet of paper or a phone book under Larry Bird's sneakers during a jump shot, the paper might well have stayed stuck between the sole and the floor. But he possessed a mind that operated on a completely different time frequency, something no modern high-performance lab could replicate through scientific methods. Bird had absolute mastery of spatial geometry and anticipatory reaction timing. While other players saw basketball as a sequence of physical impacts, explosive speed, and muscular displays above the rim, Bird saw the court as a two-dimensional board governed by immutable physical and mathematical laws. He knew exactly the bounce rate and rigidity of every iron rim in every gymnasium in North America. He knew perfectly the loose floorboards and dead spots of the Boston Garden floor and used those structural flaws to induce mechanical errors in opposing guards. He played in a dimension where everything seemed to happen in slow motion for him, letting him anticipate defensive rotations 3 or 4 seconds before any other body on the court made its first voluntary move. On that particular night of the regular season at Market Square Arena, the physical atmosphere seemed to carry a dangerous electric voltage. The Indianapolis arena was completely packed, with more than 17,000 fans squeezed into rigid metal bleachers and folding chairs lining the sidelines. The air inside the enclosed venue was a suffocating, dense mix of cigarette and cigar smoke, still allowed in indoor arenas at the time, the strong smell of popcorn with hydrogenated butter, and the accumulated sweat of thousands of men who treated local basketball not as commercial entertainment, but as a direct extension of their family honor and their working-class work ethic. The Pacers were in a painful process of technical rebuilding, trying to prove to the rest of the country that they could compete on equal footing with the great wealthy dynasties of the East Coast. And Larry Bird's Celtics, though dealing daily with the inevitable weight of advancing age, back pain, and inflamed joints, still carried the mystical aura of invincibility that came from 3 world championships won with blood and sweat that same decade. The game was rough, physical, almost violent by modern standards of the sport. The NBA of that era allowed physical contact that today would result in multi-game suspensions and league criminal investigations. Elbows in the paint were handed out like simple business cards by heavy big men. Defenders grabbed attackers' jerseys and waists with both hands, without referees blinking an eye. And any drive toward the basket came with a hard impact that sent players crashing straight into the padded iron backboard support. Reggie Miller was in his natural element. He tirelessly ran through his big men's blind double screens, dodged Boston defenders' desperate interception attempts, and fired off his shots with an unorthodox, absurdly quick release. And with every ball that found the bottom of the net, his mouth opened to fire at Larry Bird. He kept telling Bird he was washed up, that his golden era was over, that this arena now belonged to him, and that the old man couldn't keep up with his pace anymore. Larry Bird heard every insulting word without moving a single muscle in his pale, expressive face. His expression stayed cold, almost bored, like an old farmer watching a summer storm roll over the fields, knowing perfectly well the rain will pass and the soil will soak it up. He didn't respond right away with the typical childish playground insults. He preferred to spend his mental energy meticulously logging Miller's mechanical behavior patterns. Bird noticed, after a few possessions, that Reggie always took 2 short, quick steps to the right before setting his base for a long-distance shot, and that the weight of his slim body leaned slightly backward whenever he was hit with tougher physical contact near the sideline. Bird was, in fact, collecting statistical and geometric data in real time, patiently waiting for the exact moment the young guard's verbal arrogance would turn into a perfect mathematical opening for his psychological trap. Early in the third quarter of the game, the lead on the scoreboard swung between the two teams every couple of possessions. The home crowd roared deafeningly with every point Reggie scored, genuinely believing they were witnessing the official passing of the torch of Indiana State basketball to the new generation of athletes. It was right after a particularly difficult three-pointer from Miller, where he floated acrobatically in the air and converted the shot fading backward even with Kevin McHale's huge hand entirely covering his peripheral vision, that the young player decided to make the most costly, stupid mistake of his professional life. He ran toward Larry Bird, stopped just inches from the veteran's chest, looked him in the eyes, and made the frozen hand gesture, laughing openly at the living legend of the sport. Bird kept his eyes fixed on Miller's, unblinking. The tense silence that formed between the two players in the middle of that noisy court carried the suffocating weight of an approaching Midwestern storm. Bird took a deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between their faces until Miller could feel the heat of his breath, and broke his own silence with a soft voice, drawn out by his rustic French lick accent, but cold as the ice of a harsh winter, telling Miller he talked too much for a man with such a light, empty wallet, and proposing right then and there a wager, $40,000 in cash, counted twice, that on the very next Celtics possession, Bird would tell him exactly what was about to happen on that court, and Miller would pay every cent of it before leaving that building. $40,000 in the 1980s represented a monumental sum of money for any ordinary American citizen. For a rookie or early career player in the league like Reggie Miller, that amounted to a very significant fraction of his net annual earnings after contract deductions, the market price of an extremely comfortable residential property in the most upscale, sought-after areas of Indianapolis. But Miller's wounded pride, shaped by the daily humiliations suffered at the hands of his sister Cheryl, and by the early boos from his own hometown crowd, simply wouldn't let him back down from anyone, least of all a veteran he considered washed up. He looked straight back into Larry Bird's cold, pale blue eyes and answered immediately, without stammering, taking the bet and daring Bird to show him what he had left besides chronic back pain and old sneakers. The verbal agreement was formally sealed at center court. The other 8 players sharing the floor at that moment, the coaches on the benches, and the referees in their striped uniforms and metal whistles, suddenly became invisible to the two of them. The entire universe had narrowed down to 2 men and 1 inflated piece of leather. The ball was inbounded from the baseline by the Celtics after Miller's basket. Dennis Johnson, Boston's experienced, calm, cerebral guard, who had already won enough world championships to recognize the smell of blood and psychological tension on the court, brought the ball up, dribbling slowly, deliberately burning shot clock seconds to let the play develop. He looked straight at Larry Bird. Bird made no explosive move, no scrambling run. He didn't try to run around Robert Parrish's or Kevin McHale's heavy, punishing screens, and he didn't try to shove Reggie Miller with sharp elbows. He simply walked with heavy, flat, calculated steps toward the right side of the court, planting his feet right on the three-point line, less than a yard from the Indiana Pacers bench. The opposing team's reserve players immediately began screaming hysterically to try to break his concentration, shouting insults and jokes about his physical condition and advancing age. Reggie Miller stuck tight to his broad back. His long hands and extremely nimble fingers constantly touched Bird's waistline, feeling every cubic inch of weight shift and mechanical intent from the Boston veteran. Reggie was determined not to give up a single inch of physical space for the shot. He knew perfectly well that if he forced Larry Bird to catch the ball even one step farther from the iron rim, the natural geometry of the shot would change, the force required would be different, and the chances of a mechanical miss would increase drastically in the Pacers' favor. Larry Bird raised his right arm imposingly, calling for the ball with his palm fully open for the pass. But before the ball left Dennis Johnson's steady hands, Bird turned his head slightly back, glanced sideways directly at Miller's tense face, and, with the pinpoint precision of an architect or civil engineer describing the blueprint of a building, spoke the exact words that would be burned into Reggie's mind for the rest of his life. He told him precisely where on the floor he would catch the ball, right in front of Miller's own teammates who were shouting nonsense, that he would take one hard dribble backward to set his feet against the line, that Miller would jump with everything his young body had, and his right arm would just graze past Bird's left shoulder, that the ball would rise in an extremely high arc, sail past Miller's outstretched fingertips, kiss the back inside of the iron rim with precision, and drop straight through the net without so much as touching the side cords. $40,000 in cash, he said, telling the kid to pay close attention to the lesson he was about to teach him. Dennis Johnson's pass cut across the court in a firm, perfectly straight horizontal line that hit Larry Bird right at chest height. Bird took control of the leather ball with his back to the Indiana Pacers basket, using his wide hips, heavy legs, and considerable body mass to completely seal Reggie Miller behind him, blocking any attempt at an anticipatory steal. The physical collision between the two bodies was sharp, audible from the front rows of the arena. Miller shoved with his chest violently, using his leg strength to try to move Bird's base, but the French Lick veteran stood like an ancient granite statue driven deep into Indiana's sacred ground. Exactly as he had promised with absolute precision, Bird took one hard, sharp dribble with his left hand against the waxed hardwood. The sound of the leather snapping against the floor echoed through the entire arena like a warning shot in an empty library. That single, calculated dribble created exactly the few inches of separation, the scarce but sufficient space a master of geometry needs to perform his mechanical miracle. Then, the complex body rotation began fluidly. Bird pivoted on his left heel with impressive smoothness, bringing his entire body to face the basket in one continuous motion that seemed to completely ignore the sharp pain destroying his lumbar vertebrae daily. He raised the basketball above his head, adopting that classic, unorthodox, unattractive mechanic where the final release of the shot happened almost behind his right ear, shielded by his own skull. Reggie Miller didn't hesitate for a single millisecond. He used the full power and muscular explosion of his young 20-something legs and jumped vertically toward Bird with both arms fully extended in the air. Miller's long fingers cut through the cold arena air mere millimeters from Bird's pale face, matching with mathematical exactness the defensive trajectory the veteran himself had predicted seconds earlier. Reggie's right arm grazed past Bird's shoulder, almost completely blocking the shooter's direct line of sight to the iron rim. In that critical instant, any ordinary or mid-level player would have hesitated on the force or altered the release angle to avoid the incoming block. But Larry Bird didn't operate under the laws of ordinary optical vision, he operated under the immutable laws of deep muscle memory, spatial calculation, and absolute mental certainty. The leather ball left the fingertips of Larry Bird's right hand at the highest, most critical point of his modest jump. The reverse spin applied to the leather through the final flick of his wrist was so perfect, clean, and uniform that the ball's black seams seemed to trace static lines in the air as it rose toward the ceiling. The arc of the shot was absurdly high, clearing the line of the industrial lights of Market Square Arena and reaching the absolute peak of its trajectory, more than 17 feet above the hardwood floor, before beginning its fatal descent toward the rim defended by the home team. Time seemed to slow down dramatically for the more than 17,000 people in the stands of that arena. No one could breathe or make a sound. The Indiana Pacers bench players, who moments earlier had been screaming and gesturing to break the concentration of Boston's number 33, instantly froze in place, eyes fixed on the perfect parabola crossing the airspace of Indianapolis. The ball's descent was a perfect straight line toward the exact center of the backboard's red square. It fulfilled, with absolute scientific rigor, every technical and spatial specification Larry Bird had arrogantly dictated to Reggie Miller before the play began. The leather sphere passed right over the outstretched fingers of the Pacers guard, completely avoided the front edge of the rigid metal, traveled through the empty space of the iron rim, and struck the back inner wall of the metal with pinpoint precision, dropping straight down toward the floor. What followed was a sharp crack, a short, clean, crisp snap of the net's nylon being pulled taut from top to bottom by the force of gravity and leather, without the ball touching any of the side cords or ties of the support. The dead silence that immediately settled over the Indiana Pacers bench and across the entire Market Square Arena was so dense, heavy, and oppressive that you could clearly hear the mechanical hum of the industrial ventilation system mounted high in the gym's ceiling. Larry Bird didn't celebrate the three-pointer in any flashy way. He didn't look at the basket to check whether the ball had really gone through the net, and he didn't hold up three fingers to the home crowd to rub the opponent's mistake in their faces. In the exact split second the sacred leather left his index fingers, he had already turned his back completely on the play and started his slow, heavy, dragging, calculated walk back to his own defensive end. He passed less than a foot from Reggie Miller, who still stood frozen on the court with his right arm rigidly extended in the air, eyes wide with disbelief, completely unable to process the mathematical and psychological humiliation he had just suffered in front of his own crowd. Bird didn't even glance directly at the young Pacers guard's frozen face. He just kept his eyes fixed on the other end of the court, held out his open left hand at Miller's waist level, cold and businesslike, and told him, in the calm tone of a government clerk collecting an overdue fee, that he wanted his $40,000 in cash, in $100 bills, and that Miller had better wash his mouth out before trying to talk to him again the next time he stepped onto that court. The basketball game continued after that historic play, and the Boston Celtics ended up winning the game by a very narrow margin after the clock ran out. but the final score printed on the NBA's official stat sheet became a forgettable footnote next to the tectonic, lasting impact that single long-range shot had on the psychological foundation of Reggie Miller's career. Years later, already fully established worldwide as one of the greatest and deadliest clutch shooters of all time and a highly respected member of the Basketball Hall of Fame, Reggie openly admitted in several biographical interviews that cold night at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis was his true, definitive baptism by fire in professional sports. He realized there, in the most painful, humiliating, and financially costly way possible, that to challenge the established gods of that League of Giants, talk wasn't enough. You needed the supernatural ability to back up every syllable spoken with real-world execution, bordering on absolute perfection under the harshest level of competitive stress. The most reliable sources from behind the scenes and locker rooms of that golden era of the NBA say Reggie Miller genuinely honored every cent of that $40,000 verbal bet. He didn't make flimsy excuses in the locker room after the game ended, didn't tell reporters it was just harmless trash talk meant to rattle his opponent's focus, and didn't ask Larry Bird's financial people for any kind of discount or extended deadline. He came up with the cash because he knew perfectly well that if he backed out or ran from the deal in that critical moment of his youth, he would irreversibly lose the one thing that keeps an elite competitor alive and respected in that brutal league of ironmen: self-respect and a solid reputation as a man of his word among his own peers. Larry Bird accepted the money in silence, but he also stored away in his mind a new, deep understanding of the young Indiana Pacers guard. Bird realized that, despite the irritating youthful arrogance and the overactive mouth on the court, Reggie Miller had a rigid backbone and unshakable character as a basketball competitor. Other players of lesser mental caliber would have psychologically crumbled after suffering a humiliation of that magnitude. They would have hidden in the next game, avoided calling for the ball in decisive moments, or dissolved into theatrical complaints to the referees to deflect from their own mechanical mistakes. Reggie Miller did exactly the opposite. He kept playing hard and physical until the final second of the clock, kept calling for the ball on the following possessions, and in the years to come became the biggest, most feared, and most relentless executioner the Boston Celtics and the New York Knicks would face throughout the entire decade of the 90s. What does this mythic eternal behind-the-scenes bet reveal to us deep down about the true nature of human talent and applied psychology in high-performance environments under extreme stress? In today's world of contemporary global sports, where nearly every professional athlete is monitored by ultra-high-resolution electronic sensors, three-dimensional body motion trackers, and complex artificial intelligence software that calculates the exact efficiency of every angle of body tilt during movement, we have a strong cultural tendency to reduce athletic success to a cold mathematical equation of statistical probabilities. Data analysts spend endless hours discussing colorful heat maps and advanced metrics to predict whether a shot should or shouldn't be taken at a given critical second of the game based on defenders' positioning. And yet, no modern computer on the planet, and no advanced biomechanical analysis will ever be able to decode, replicate, or mathematically quantify the invisible, spiritual, psychological element that allowed Larry Bird to charge $40,000 in cash for a basket called in advance, with pinpoint precision against a defender glued to his back, unshakable inner conviction, and absolute mental clarity. That absolute, almost prophetic certainty displayed by Bird isn't born from raw genetic talent handed out passively, and it isn't distributed randomly by fate to a lucky few. It is meticulously built, brick by brick, through thousands of repetitive hours of silent, solitary practice, in dark, cold gyms where absolutely no one is watching or recording, when the main arena lights have already been switched off by the staff, and the only audible sound in the empty venue is the exhausted athlete's own heart pounding violently against his ribs. That deep conviction comes from a humble, scarce, cold childhood spent deep in the Indiana countryside, throwing an old, worn leather ball against the makeshift plywood backboard while his fingers froze from the thick snow relentlessly falling outside the yard. It comes from an entire career spent wrestling with the limits of one's own body and turning pain into genius.